When my father passed away, he left behind a legacy that was supposed to be mine. His sprawling farm, the house we'd called home for generations, and a modest sum of money. It was a testament to years of his hard work, and it meant the world to me. Yet, none of it ever reached my hands. At the funeral, amid the sea of sympathetic faces, I noticed the steely determination in my stepmother Clara's eyes. She wasn't mourning, she was planning. I didn't know it then, but Clara had already taken steps to ensure that every penny, every acre of land, and even the smallest memento from my father would belong to her. The reading of the will was supposed to bring closure, but it only brought betrayal. Clara had convinced my father in his final years to rewrite his will, leaving everything to her. She claimed it was his wish, that it would keep the family united. But I knew better. Her honeyed words and calculated manipulations had stripped me of my birthright. For months, I tried to reason with her. I begged, I argued, I pleaded. But each attempt was met with her cold, dismissive smile. "Your father trusted me," she would say, her tone dripping with false sympathy. "Maybe you should too." By the time I realized that no amount of reasoning would change her mind, the farm was sold, the money was spent, and my connection to my father's legacy was nothing more than a memory. But Clara had underestimated me. She thought I would let it go, that I would move on quietly. Instead, I began to plan. The first spark of revenge came to me on a rainy afternoon. I was at my apartment, staring at an old photo of my father and me from years ago. We were standing in the fields, the sun setting behind us, the crops lush and green. That land was supposed to be my future, his gift to me. Clara had stolen it, and she had to pay. But revenge is a delicate thing. It's not about anger, it's about precision. Clara was clever, calculating, and ruthless, which meant I had to be smarter. I spent weeks researching her life, peeling back the layers she'd so carefully constructed. She lived in a gated mansion now, far removed from the farm she'd sold. She hosted extravagant parties and dined with the elite, her name often appearing in the society columns. And then there was her business, a high-end boutique that catered to the wealthy. She'd built it on the profits from my father's farm, branding it as a labor of love born from loss. The irony was sickening. But her boutique wasn't just a vanity project. It was her pride, her identity, and most importantly, her vulnerability. I visited the boutique one afternoon, pretending to be a customer. The staff was polite, the decor opulent, and every item absurdly overpriced. Clara wasn't there, but her fingerprints were on everything, the extravagant displays, the carefully curated ambience. I walked out with a small purchase, a scarf I didn't need, but more importantly, I left with a plan forming in my mind. Clara's world was built on a foundation of stolen wealth and lies. To dismantle it, I had to strike at the heart of her empire. But first, I needed allies, people who had suffered at her hands, who would want to see her fall just as much as I did. Finding others who despised Clara wasn't difficult. She had a knack for making enemies. I started with the former farmhands, the ones she fired when she sold my father's land. They were hard-working people who had spent decades on the farm, some working alongside my father long before Clara even entered the picture. I tracked down Eduardo, the foreman, now working odd jobs at a construction site. When I approached him, he looked at me with guarded eyes. "What do you want, kid?" he asked, wiping sweat from his brow. "I want Clara to pay for what she's done," I said plainly. His expression softened slightly, but there was still caution in his tone. "She took everything from your father," he said. "She took everything from all of us. But what can we do? She's untouchable." "Not if we work together," I replied. "I know she's not as untouchable as she wants people to think." Eduardo hesitated but eventually nodded. "You have my ear, but no promises," he said. It was a start. Next, I visited a lawyer my father had worked with briefly before Clara swept in and changed everything. Her name was Evelyn, and she had a reputation for being relentless in the courtroom. Evelyn remembered my father fondly, and was visibly upset when I told her what had happened. "I always suspected she manipulated him," Evelyn said, shaking her head. "Your father was too trusting. She must have isolated him in his final days. Can you help me?" I asked. Evelyn gave me a measured look. "It depends. What are you planning? Something that's legal enough to keep us safe, but just risky enough to make her regret everything," I said, leaning forward. Evelyn smirked. "I like the sound of that. I'm in." Over the next few weeks, Eduardo introduced me to others who had been wronged by Clara, and Evelyn helped me dig into her financial records and legal history. We uncovered a trail of shady dealings, hidden debts, questionable business practices, and a few skeletons she'd rather keep buried. The pieces were falling into place. Clara had built her life on appearances, but behind the polished facade, there were cracks, and I intended to widen them until everything came crashing down. Clara had always prided herself on her reputation. To the outside world, she was a sophisticated entrepreneur, a philanthropist who donated to charities and attended galas. But Evelyn and I knew the truth now. The boutique that Clara had built wasn't as lucrative as it appeared. It was being propped up by loans she could barely repay. If her image took even the smallest hit, it would all crumble like a house of cards. The first step was subtle. I needed to make her feel untouchable, confident in the fortress she had built around herself. Eduardo, posing as a potential supplier, began negotiating with her boutique under a fake name. He offered her a deal too good to pass up, luxury products at a fraction of their market value. Clara's greed got the better of her, and she agreed without fully vetting the offer. Meanwhile, Evelyn and I were working on a larger plan. We found out that Clara's boutique was under investigation for tax irregularities. It wasn't public knowledge yet, but the authorities were sniffing around her books. Evelyn reached out to a trusted journalist, someone she had worked with in the past, and planted the seeds of a story. "The trick," Evelyn said one evening as we pored over documents, "is to let her dig her own grave. She'll slip up if we apply just the right amount of pressure." The timing had to be perfect. Eduardo's fake deal escalated, promising Clara a massive shipment of goods for an exclusive launch event. She began promoting the event heavily, plastering her face all over social media and society columns. She was back in the spotlight, just as we needed her to be. On the night of the event, Clara's boutique was transformed into a glittering showcase. The city's elite attended, sipping champagne and marveling at the supposed exclusivity of the collection. Clara was in her element, smiling and basking in the attention. But behind the scenes, the walls were closing in. Evelyn had tipped off the authorities about the irregularities in Clara's finances, and Eduardo's shipment was never going to arrive. The journalist we contacted was in attendance, armed with the dirt we had uncovered, ready to ask Clara pointed questions that would make her squirm. I watched from a distance, blending into the crowd, as the evening unfolded. Clara's confident smile faltered when the journalist approached her, microphone in hand. "Mrs. Bennet," the journalist began, using her married name, "there are rumors that your boutique is under investigation for financial misconduct. Care to comment?" Clara froze, her eyes darting around the room as whispers spread like wildfire. "That's ridiculous," she said, forcing a laugh. "My business is perfectly legitimate." But then the journalist pressed further, presenting documents Evelyn had provided, copies of transactions that hinted at fraud. Clara's mask began to slip, her responses becoming defensive and erratic. As the whispers grew louder, the crowd began to thin. Guests murmured to one another, exchanging suspicious glances. And then the final blow came. Eduardo, playing the role of the supplier, approached Clara in front of everyone. "Mrs. Bennet," he said loudly, his voice cutting through the murmurs. "Where's the payment for my shipment? You promised me you'd wire the funds yesterday." Clara's face turned pale. "What are you talking about?" she hissed. "This is neither the time nor the place." Eduardo didn't back down. "Oh, I think it is. You owe me tens of thousands, and now I hear your boutique's under investigation? I want my money." The scene was a disaster. Cameras flashed as guests filmed the spectacle on their phones. Clara's carefully crafted image was collapsing in real time. The authorities arrived shortly after, escorted by Evelyn's journalist contact. They didn't arrest Clara on the spot, but they began questioning her, making it clear that her financial dealings were now very much in the public eye. From my corner of the room, I allowed myself a small smile. This was only the beginning. The days following the event were a whirlwind of chaos for Clara. The footage of her confrontation at the boutique went viral. News outlets picked up the story, framing her as a fraud masquerading as a businesswoman. Her social media accounts, once filled with admiration, were now flooded with scorn and ridicule. For the first time, Clara was forced to go silent. She issued no statements, no denials. It was clear she was scrambling behind the scenes, trying to salvage her reputation. But the damage had been done. Her creditors, already suspicious, began calling in their loans. Suppliers canceled contracts, unwilling to be associated with her tarnished name. Evelyn and I had planned for this. We knew Clara would try to use what resources she had left to control the narrative. That's when we launched the second phase of our plan. Eduardo came forward publicly, sharing his story about how Clara had manipulated and fired the farmhands who had been loyal to my father. Evelyn coordinated with other employees Clara had wronged over the years, gathering testimonies about her unethical practices. The media loved it, a woman who built her empire by betraying the very people who trusted her. One particular news segment hit Clara the hardest. It featured Eduardo standing in front of the farm, now overgrown and abandoned, recounting the day Clara had announced its sale. He spoke about how she had walked through the fields with a real estate agent, pointing out every feature she could market while ignoring the workers who had spent their lives tending the land. "That farm wasn't just a place," Eduardo said, his voice heavy with emotion. "It was a legacy. She didn't just sell land, she sold memories, history, and the livelihood of dozens of families." The story gained traction, drawing public sympathy for the farmhands and outrage against Clara. People began demanding answers, asking how someone could act with such callous disregard for others. Meanwhile, Clara's financial troubles were accelerating. The boutique couldn't sustain itself without its high-profile clients and suppliers, and with creditors breathing down her neck, Clara was forced to sell her mansion. It was a humiliating blow, and I made sure to attend the auction of her belongings, standing quietly in the back as her treasures were sold off to strangers. I could see the toll it was taking on her. When Clara walked out of the mansion for the last time, she was a shadow of the woman I'd once known. Her hair was no longer immaculately styled, and the confidence in her stride had given way to uncertainty. But I wasn't done yet. The final act of revenge was personal. Clara had always been obsessed with appearances, and nothing would wound her more than exposing the truth about how she'd secured my father's will. Evelyn and I had uncovered a key piece of evidence, a letter written by my father just weeks before his death. In it, he expressed doubts about changing his will but mentioned that Clara had insisted it was necessary for the good of the family. We had also tracked down a former nurse who cared for my father during his final days. The nurse, an older woman named Martha, revealed that Clara had limited my father's visitors, claiming he needed rest. In reality, Clara had isolated him, making sure no one could question her influence. With Martha's testimony and the letter, we had everything we needed to file a lawsuit challenging the legitimacy of the will. Evelyn drafted the documents, and we sent them to Clara just as she was settling into her much smaller rental home. I delivered the papers myself. She opened the door hesitantly, and when she saw me standing there, her eyes narrowed. "What do you want?" she asked, her voice tired but still sharp. I handed her the envelope. "Justice," I said simply. Clara's hands trembled as she read the contents. "You can't be serious," she said, her voice breaking. "You're dragging this out of spite." "No, Clara," I replied, my tone cold. "I'm doing this because you stole from me. You stole from my father. And now, it's time you face the consequences." The lawsuit made headlines. People who had followed Clara's fall from grace were captivated by the story of her manipulating a dying man to rewrite his will. Evelyn made sure the media had access to every piece of evidence we uncovered. The public outrage was overwhelming. Clara tried to fight back, but her resources were dwindling. In court, she was a shell of the woman she used to be, her once commanding presence reduced to desperation. She tried to play the victim, claiming she had only acted out of love for my father, but the evidence against her was damning. The court ruled in my favor, declaring the will invalid. My father's assets were returned to me, though much of the farm's value was lost forever. Clara was ordered to pay damages, but with her financial ruin, I knew I'd see little of it. What mattered wasn't the money, it was the victory. The court ruling was a turning point, but it wasn't the end of Clara's fall. While I had reclaimed my father's legacy and name, much of the damage she had caused was irreversible. The farm was gone, sold off to developers who had already broken ground on a soulless luxury housing project. Seeing the land scarred like that was a bitter pill to swallow, but I reminded myself that this fight was never just about the land. It was about restoring my father's memory and showing Clara she couldn't get away with what she'd done. For Clara, the ruling marked the beginning of her descent into obscurity. The media, which had once fawned over her as a self-made woman, now tore her apart, labeling her a manipulative fraud. Her name became a cautionary tale in business circles, and the elite circles she'd once dominated closed their doors to her. As her financial situation worsened, Clara was forced to take a job managing a small consignment shop in a rundown part of town. It was a far cry from the glamorous boutique she once owned. I visited the shop once, not to gloat but to see her with my own eyes. She was behind the counter, her once pristine nails chipped, her sharp suits replaced by simple, worn clothes. When she saw me, there was no anger in her eyes, only exhaustion. "You got what you wanted," she said quietly. "No," I replied. "What I wanted was my father back. But since I can't have that, I'll settle for this." Clara didn't respond, and I walked out, leaving her to the quiet misery of her new life. As Clara's life continued its inexorable descent into ruin, the once mighty facade she had so carefully constructed began to collapse under the weight of her mounting failures, her name no longer gracing society pages, but whispered in scandalous tones by those who once envied her, her grand mansion stripped from her grasp as the bank seized it to pay off her towering debts. Her boutique permanently shuttered after suppliers refused to work with her and creditors circled like predators, and her days spent in the dim, joyless confines of a small consignment shop where she now worked long hours for barely enough pay to cover her rent, her manicured fingers now stained from handling second-hand goods, her sharp designer wardrobe replaced by drab, functional attire that seemed a physical manifestation of her new reality, and yet, as I watched her from afar, each step of her fall meticulously orchestrated, I wondered whether she felt the full weight of what she had done, whether in the stillness of her small apartment, surrounded by the absence of everything she had taken for granted, she thought about my father, about the legacy she had so ruthlessly stolen, and the countless lives she had disrupted in the process, or whether her tears, if they fell at all, were shed solely for herself and the glories she had lost, her once powerful connections now ghosts. her admirers now distant observers reveling in the spectacle of her decline, and though the fire of anger in me had long since cooled, replaced by a grim determination to see justice served, I could not deny the satisfaction of seeing her stripped of the power she had wielded so mercilessly, the empire of deceit and manipulation reduced to ashes. Yet even then, there remained one final act, one last piece of the reckoning that I needed to deliver, not out of hatred but out of a need for closure, to ensure that she understood fully the cost of her actions, that she could never again delude herself into believing she had triumphed, and so, with the remnants of my father's legacy reclaimed, and the memories of what she had done burning brightly in my mind, I readied myself for the confrontation that would mark the end of our tangled story, the final step in a journey that had begun with betrayal, but would end with a reckoning so complete that even Clara, in the silence of her despair, would have no choice but to face the truth of the life she had destroyed, the man she had betrayed, and the justice that had caught up to her at last. It was a cold and overcast morning when I made my way to Clara's small, dingy apartment, a far cry from the opulent mansion she had once called home, the kind of place where the paint chipped off the walls, the elevator creaked ominously, and the stale scent of neglect lingered in the air, a physical representation of how far she had fallen. And as I climbed the stairs, each step echoing hollowly in the dimly lit stairwell, I couldn't help but feel the weight of this moment, the culmination of years of planning, heartbreak, and loss, the moment where I would finally confront her face to face, not as the naive young man she had once dismissed, but as someone who had rebuilt himself and reclaimed everything she had stolen. And as I reached her door, my heart pounding with a mixture of anticipation and finality, I raised my hand to knock, pausing for a brief moment to steady my resolve, knowing that what came next would leave no room for ambiguity, that the reckoning I had promised myself and my father was now at hand. When Clara opened the door, I barely recognized her. The woman who had once been so poised, so polished, now looked tired and aged, her eyes shadowed with sleepless nights and the weight of her shattered life, her once pristine hair now streaked with gray, her posture no longer proud but defensive, as though she knew deep down that she deserved the punishment she had endured. And as our eyes met, a flicker of recognition passed between us, an unspoken understanding that this was the end of the road, though she tried to mask it with a weak smile that faltered almost immediately, her voice brittle as she greeted me with a forced politeness that couldn't hide the tremor in her words. "What do you want?" she asked, her tone flat, almost resigned, as if she already knew the answer, and I stepped into the small, sparsely furnished apartment, my eyes scanning the room that seemed so utterly devoid of life, stripped of the lavish comforts she once surrounded herself with, now reduced to a space as barren as the future she faced. And I turned to her, my voice steady, my gaze unwavering, as I replied, "We need to talk, Clara. This ends here today." She sank into the worn couch, her shoulders slumping as though the weight of the last few years had finally crushed whatever strength she had left, and for a moment, I almost felt pity for her, this woman who had once loomed so large in my life, who had manipulated and destroyed without remorse, now sitting before me, hollowed out and broken. But I pushed that feeling aside, reminded myself of the damage she had caused, of my father's final days spent under her control, isolated and coerced into rewriting his will, of the workers she had discarded without a second thought, of the land she had sold, and the family legacy she had trampled on in her pursuit of wealth and status, and I knew there was no room for pity here, not today. "I want you to understand," I began, my voice calm but firm, "that everything you've lost, every moment of pain and humiliation you've experienced, is a direct result of the choices you made. You didn't just betray my father, you betrayed everyone who trusted you, everyone who believed in you, and you did it without a shred of remorse, thinking you could get away with it, but you were wrong, Clara. You thought you were untouchable, but you weren't, and now you're left with nothing but the truth of who you are." Clara's eyes flickered with something, regret, anger, maybe even shame, But she didn't interrupt, her hands gripping the edge of the couch as though holding on for support, and I continued, laying out everything I had uncovered, the letter my father wrote before she manipulated him into changing his will, the testimony from the nurse who saw how she isolated him, the trail of debts and deceit that propped up her boutique, and the lives she had destroyed along the way, every word hitting her like a hammer, her face pale and drawn as she absorbed the full scope of what she had done and the justice that had finally caught up to her. "I didn't deserve this," she whispered at last, her voice cracking, her eyes glistening with tears that I couldn't decide were genuine or self-pitying, but I shook my head, my resolve unshaken. "No, Clara," I said, my tone as cold as the gray light filtering through her window. "You deserved exactly this. You made your choices, and now you're living with the consequences. My father is gone, the farm is gone, but what you can never take away from me is the truth, and now the world knows it too. You wanted power, and all you got was emptiness." For a long moment, silence filled the room, thick and suffocating, as Clara stared down at her hands, the reality of her downfall settling over her like a heavy cloak, and I knew then that there was nothing more to say, that the final act of this long, painful story had played out, and as I turned to leave, stepping out of that lifeless apartment and into the cool, fresh air of the street below, I felt a strange mix of emotions, relief, closure, and an overwhelming sense of freedom, knowing that the chapter Clara had written in my life was finally closed, and as I walked away, leaving her to the ruins of her choices, I carried with me not just the legacy of my father, but the strength to move forward, knowing that justice had been served and that the past, no matter how painful, no longer held power over me.